What's happening, folks? It's your boy Jack Slack, Fights Gone By podcast, coming at you on Friday the 22nd of November, and it's bloody rainy here. Kind of grim day, but kind of grim week, because there's not really a lot going on. In fact, we've got a sort of 2-week hiatus in most mixed martial arts competition before we come back for... Well, we got Rosenstruck versus Overeem, which is like a little event, and then we got UFC 245 or 6, whichever one it is, with Usman versus Covington, which will be fun, and we'll be gearing up towards that. Or, obviously be doing loads of shit for that because there's like 3 title fights on it. So we'll keep it short this week. It'll be a clipped episode because, like I said, there's almost nothing going on. But we'll probably get into some more gossipy stuff. I know people like that I don't do as much gossip stuff as most of the MMA media, and I know that I also get on my high horse about it, but I'm also going to do it now. Let's talk about the news. I mean, the big piece this week is that Ben Askren has announced his retirement from MMA. He also announced that he needs a hip replacement, but he was trying to keep that, he was downplaying that because he didn't want to make excuses for his losses. I think we all understand that having a better hip probably wouldn't have stopped him from diving onto a flying knee against Jorge Masvidal. And, it was the ground game that against Maia, because he didn't really have any striking, so he had to take him to the ground. And, he, good hip or bad hip, your top game is not going to be good enough to pass Damian Maia without an awful lot of work and experience. But I think that... it's brought out sort of the worst and the best of the MMA world, as any of these announcements do. A lot of people are respectful and saying, Askren did, his record doesn't reflect how much excitement he brought to the division in sort of like the last year, because we all assumed he's already retired once. He retired after that nonsense fight with Shinya Aoki, where Shinya Aoki went up to welterweight, one welterweight, so what is that, 190 pounds? I don't know, but breaks off a washed-up Shinya Aoki and retired then because one didn't have anyone for him to fight. And then they did that weird trade with Demetrius Johnson for Ben Askren, and suddenly Ben Askren's in with the best welterweights in the world, and we get to see just what he can do. And, aside from the Masvidal fight, he did interesting shit in both the other fights. His skill set was difficult, and he had some very tough matchups. I said from the get-go, Robbie Lawler's a hard matchup, because we watched him, all he's been doing in recent years is stuffing takedowns and hitting people. He got by Robbie Lawler. I was very much on the what a bullshit stoppage side of that equation, but certainly that fight proved to you that Ben Askren was not just the hammer. He could deal with being the nail as well, which was always sort of a question, because if you don't ever learn to strike and all you do is hold people down and slap them around while they're on the ground, that people are going to assume that you're not tough. And of course that fight proved that nothing could be further from the truth. Got his face all broke open in the opening seconds, looked like he was going to get TKO'd, rebounded and choked Robbie Lawler's face. And the Maia fight was really entertaining too, but I think he might have done himself a disservice by asking for that fight and being like, I want Damian Maia, let's do the best grappler MMA. Because when you look at it, you go, well, what were you going to do? I thought maybe we'd have a shitty kickboxing match on the feet, but he didn't even really do that. He was gamely trying to take him down and then didn't really have anything to do when he was on the ground. I mean, Ben Askren's pretty much an oddity because, well, firstly an oddity because you're never going to see a fighter get to that level with such a lack of rounded skills, but also... what is he, folk style, isn't he? Because that's what everyone was saying after he came to the fore and Habib was using wrist traps and things. Everyone was like, oh, folk style's the best base for MMA now. And isn't folk style the one that you only do for like a couple of years in school in the US, and they don't really have it anywhere else in the world? It's all freestyle or Greco-Roman. So really weird, that style that he brought, and I enjoy that. I always enjoy the oddities. We've been saying for ages, whenever we point to how bad wrestling is for you generally, we say, look at Ben Askren, he walks like he's got a steel rod up his back, or he's got a full nappy. He always walks like he's shat himself. And it turns out he needs a hip replacement, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's got a ton of back issues as well. He's always doing headstands and shit in his wrestling career. It is a very hard sport. I think that's the thing, you get guys coming to... It's kind of like the Thais, having all those fights as children, and then they get to 30 and start dropping off hard. I think you get the same thing with wrestlers coming to MMA. You know, they're amazing, but they have also had a full combat sports career before that where they weren't paid. So it's like taking 400 amateur fights and then going professional. I mean, Lomachenko aside, most people, that's going to take a horrible toll on them. Lots of people being absolute shitlords about this, of course, being like, what was Ben Askren's real input into the sport? You can't name anything as his legacy. And I would say he gave Demetrius Johnson the chance to escape to one and not have to take the rematch with Henry Cejudo, even while claiming that he won the second one. That was his real input to MMA. I think, you know, ultimately, I think the UFC probably won out of that trade. There are still some people who tune into one for DJ's fights, but there are just as many people who just go, oh, DJ's fighting, look up DJ's fight, which is online for free, and that's it. They don't sit around and watch the one events. They don't care about the rest of the one events. It's like the Eddie Alvarez in the Lightweight Grand Prix. When Christian Lee replaced whoever it was in the final, everyone went, who the fuck is Christian Lee? And you're like, he's the guy with the actual belt. He's the one we're all supposed to be excited for when Eddie Alvarez or whoever gets to the end of the tournament. Whereas, as much as Ben Askren lost, he did certainly put a good amount of shine on Jorge Masvidal, who really, up until the Till knockout and the Askren knockout, like I always say, it takes 2 good knockouts or 2 good finishes, and then suddenly you're a sensation. Before that, he was just sort of like he was a very good fighter. Everyone who knew him and watched his fights knew he was very good, but he was just sort of a mundane decision-y guy. You know, he had these moments where he'd hurt people, but then he'd sit back and then he'd get to the split decision and not have done enough and lose it. But Ben Askren, that whole thing, Ben Askren talking it up, talking all the trash, being hilarious, that and having the payoff of, you know, Bully gets owned. That has done amazing things for Jorge Masvidal. I haven't seen any estimates on like the buy rate for Masvidal versus Diaz fight, but everyone seemed to think that it was a huge success. So what I'm saying really is, thank you, Ben Askren. It was good fun. So long, and keep training up wrestlers, because, you know, we could do with more people with weird ass styles. We could do with like a folk wrestling thing that you could do as adults. Like, this is what the BJJ subreddit were talking about the other day. They were having an argument about wrestling from the knees, which I'm not a huge fan of. I just go one up, one down. You know, if the other guy seems like he's going to fight to stay on his knees, I just pull guard. If he sits back to guard, I stand up. You know, that's how you roll in a small space if you can't go from the feet. But they were like, someone pointed out, like, oh yeah, you know, we'll just go for it high school wrestling style, like all those old high school wrestlers you see who are still practicing at the age of 40. You're like, oh yeah, there is a point there. It does kick the shit out of you. What else is going on? We got Mayweather and Dana. I mean, you could tell it's a slow week because Mayweather and Dana are putting out Instagram posts of them sitting together in like the front row of a basketball game, being like, we're working together on something big in 2020. And you're like, no, you're not. You just turned up at the same basketball game and you both have front row seats because you're both insanely wealthy. Maybe they are. But basically, half the news websites have run with this as Mayweather coming out of retirement, and half of them have run with Zuffa boxing. But what it probably is Mayweather will have some prospect or something, and he'll want to put him in the main event of Zuffa boxing whenever they actually get round to doing that. I'm still trying to work out how it's some kind of tax dodge, because I just don't see anything in it for the UFC, aside from having something on Fight Pass, which they're still trying to justify. October came and went, by the way, and they didn't relaunch it. Still waiting for those updates on Fight Pass. I suppose the big announcement was that Shevchenko versus Caitlin Chikagian is going to be going on UFC 247 for the women's, flyweight title. Yeah, I mean, not really anything to get excited about unless you're a Shevchenko fan, but if you look, that card as it stands at the moment, I believe it's February, and the only announced fights are Valentina Shevchenko versus Caitlin Chikagian, Andrea Lee versus Lauren Murphy, Mirsad Bektic versus Dan Ige, and Ovinson Pre versus Ryan. I mean, actually, that's not that bad. I was looking at that and going, it's pretty bad, but that's not that bad. And if they pack in some more good fights, that sounds like an alright event. It's kind of weird. The UFC tends to like pack out its schedule from about halfway through the year, and then you get to December and you're trying to look for future events and they've got nothing planned. It's like they don't go past December, and you're going, that's not even the financial year. Why is that the case? But no, finally they've started booking some more things into like February and March now. Still not a lot of fights on some of these January cards even. So that's why it's so slow for me as a journo at the moment. I'm not a journo, sorry, as a writer at the moment. They're talking about McGregor versus Cerrone for January 18th, but they've been teasing this one forever. Conor McGregor's been saying he's coming back for a set date. And there's a lot of argument over whether it's a tune-up or not. I think of the fights that you could give McGregor, Donald Cerrone is, I've got to come up with a term for this, but like the highest ranking fighter that you could see them having a stylistically good matchup with. We've got to think of a good name for that, because it's what I called Ricky Simone against Uriah Faber, and that proved to be, clairvoyant. But yeah, I think it's a real thing. I think that should be a term in matchmaking, not like a tune-up or an exhibition match or a squash or whatever. Should be the best possible opponent you can beat with the highest possible regard, who's going to match up with you stylistically in a favourable way. Which is what I believe Cerrone is, because, hates straight hitting and hates pressure. What does Conor McGregor do? Straight hitting and pressure. Also hates body work, and Conor McGregor gets to the body pretty well. Also doesn't really have very good takedowns. He just ducks in. He's got the Henan Barrow takedown. If you time it well, it works. If you don't, you just look like you're lunging in after the person's hit. With that being said, he has some positives coming into that matchup. Conor McGregor fades late, whereas Donald Cerrone is a slow starter who really gets going and tends to pick up his finishes at like the end of the first round, but he does well in the second and third round generally too. I think that it all comes down to Donald Cerrone's big answer to pressure has been the intercepting knee, but that really only works against committed aggression, basically. If you're applying pressure, it's the threat of your punches and strikes. You're using that to move the opponent into corners and take away space, and then you can feint them out and then step in. Watching Darren Till versus Donald Cerrone like gets on one leg trying to knee him. He's not coming in, and then Darren Till just hits him in the face when he's putting his knee down. Whereas Alexander Hernandez took the message from the previous Cerrone fights that you just have to run and stay in his face, and he just kept coming in from long range, running straight in and eating the knee. And you're going, how did your camp let this be the strategy? That's pretty incredible that they just sent you out there to run in over and over again. Though Hernandez was pretty much dwarfed in that fight. He looked really small. Anyway, let's move on. Joanna and Jacek put out an interesting interview this week where she talked about splitting with, quote, vultures in her camp. She split up with her fiancé and her manager, who apparently was embezzling a load of money or took a load of money off her, or was taking a ridiculous cut. One or the other. It's in a different language, and I ran it through Google Translate and then paired that up with the person who translated it in the comments. But, interesting nonetheless. It's just the story of fighters. Like, they're just too trusting. And then whenever they do cut out the guy, finally, it either tends to be they realize too late and then they miss out on all their like prime earnings, or it turns out they've just been sort of poisoned against the previous guy and then the new guy's worse. I always think of an interview that Brendan Ingle did on, I can't remember, I would think it was fucking Richard Whiteley from Countdown, but he was just talking about like the split with Prince Nazim had happened pretty recently, so he didn't really have any big names coming up. Which was a bit of a weird position to be in if you were being interviewed. So, what are you famous for? Oh, I used to manage that dude. But they were just talking about, like, why he and Naz split up. And he basically said, like, I manage and train both of my fighters, and I take 5% as a manager and 10% as a trainer or whatever it was. It might have been the other way around. And he said, and people are fine with that when it's 200 quid or 2,000 quid or 20,000 quid. But when you get to 5 million and you're giving this guy 15% of that, it's very easy for another coach or manager to swoop in and go, why are you giving that guy that much money? I'll take it for 8% or whatever. So that's part of what happens, but it's just kind of sad, On the happier end of things, Rafael dos Anjos versus Michael Chiesa was announced for January 25th. Sounds like a good fight to me. I mean, really, that's the thing with this is that it's always like Michael Chiesa is just so limited on the feet. He just doesn't have any semblance of a striking game. I say that, he hurt Kevin Lee, he knocked down Jorge Masvidal, but it's just, he can catch dudes by surprise, but he, as soon as they've been hit by him and they go, oh man, should have respected him a bit more, suddenly they're just taking him apart on the feet. Is Chiesa coming off that fight with Diego Sanchez? Because that was tragic. On the plus side, it wasn't Sakuraba versus Aoki, because everyone was like, well, give Diego Sanchez a fight where he won't get punched in the head. And actually, Chiesa stuck to that pretty well. Just grappled with him, hung on him and controlled him. Whereas Aoki versus Sakuraba, the whole time up to the fight, people were going, well, it'll be a grappling heavy fight and they'll probably have a gentleman's agreement. You're like, that's not going to happen. Do you know who Shinya Aoki is? So Shinya Aoki takes him down, mounts him, and just punches him in the face like 300 times. That was tragic. But yeah, this wasn't the case. But again, Chiesa's recent run, really not up to the level of Rafael dos Anjos's. He, since the win over Dariush, which is a good one, you can't argue with that. Jim Miller and Dariush back-to-back, good wins and good stoppages. That was 2015, 2016. But then he lost to Kevin Lee, lost to Anthony Pettis by submission, and then he beat Carlos Condit, who is royally washed, and he beats Diego Sanchez, who was washed when Carlos Condit was in his prime. So yeah, weird sort of situation for Chiesa to jump back into, but you've got to put him in somewhere. He is a good competitor, and got to jump him back in somewhere. A couple of funny stories out of the Bare Knuckle FC this week. If you didn't see it last week, I mean, it was everything you expected it to be. They're not great events. I was about to recommend it, but I think it benefits from not a lot going on. I think everyone's sort of getting over the bare knuckle thing now. I was big on it because I was interested in how it changes the outcomes and the techniques and the meta and so on. But I think once you realise that it's just washed up cage fighters and it's not going to be good boxers learning to box with no gloves on and things like that, it's I mean, you could have Paulie Malignaggi, but he's so washed up that it's ridiculous. And we talked about it before, way before before the fight was even signed, we talked about how it's the worst possible choice for Paulie Malignaggi as a guy who had no hitting power to keep people off him and had very brittle hands anyway, But they did have this fight between Artem Lobov and Jason Knight. It was a rematch. It was all right. But they inducted the first fight into the Bare Knuckle FC Hall of Fame, which they cleverly called the Bare Knuckle Hall of Fame. And the only other thing that they've inducted into that Hall of Fame was Beck Rawlings, like 2-3 months ago. Just ridiculous. It's a ridiculous promotion, and we're all very sad about it. And the other thing that they did was they announced that they've signed the Iranian Hulk, whose real name I can't pronounce and also haven't written down because it's not that important. But he's a guy who posts photos on Instagram and he just looks ridiculous. And everyone assumes Synthol, but it turns out he just photoshops his pictures. He's a big fat dude and he photoshops the fat into muscles, which is why it looks so weird. You're like, that guy looks like if you grabbed his enormous bicep, it would be completely soft. And that's why, because the guy just turns his folds into rippling muscles somehow. So it's never going to happen. What he does is what's commonly called the DMX maneuver, which is where you claim you're going to fight. You announce you let a company announce that they've signed you, and then you don't do the fight. Or what DMX says is he's just like, no, I ain't training for it. I don't need to train. And then you're like, I don't know if you're actually going to get to this fight, are you, DMX? And then he just doesn't turn up. But Iranian Hulk's done that to about 3 different places now. I think, did he do it? I thought there were threats of him joining KSW. Now, if you know me, I like KSW. They're cool guys. They let me do stuff with their footage, like the Roberto Soldic stuff. They have some very good fighters like Soldic. They had Kleber Coker, Herbst for a while. They've had a few good fighters come through there. Kaladov, Narkoon, guys like that. But they also love a freak fight. So basically, whenever I look at the listings for what's coming up this week, I have to be like, oh, KSW. And then I go, is it a good event or just one of their freak show events? And if it's headlined by Mariusz Pudzianowski, I go, okay, it's a freak show event. And I just ignore it. And yeah, I mean, he would fit in right over there. If he was real, the Iranian Hulk, if he wasn't just fictional, he'd be right at home there. But he's done it to about 3 different places now. Just said he's going to have fights and then not had fights. But also, he has a really active Instagram, and he's known for these photos of him just looking monstrous. But he's never been in a video because he is completely photoshopped. He's got the Adobe. Is it Adobe? People get mad when I say Adobe, but Adobe Gains is what they call it. And then the other weird news coming out this week was that Alan Crowder is retired from MMA. UFC heavyweight Alan Crowder most recently lost to Rosenstruck in about 9 seconds. Really spectacular KO. Part of the reason we're also hot on Rosenstruck. He's retired from MMA due to memory loss. And the article, you should go look it up because he did a little interview and it's quite harrowing. It's very reminiscent of what I always was saying about Jerry Quarry and what happened to him just shortly after he retired. And it's doubly scary because, like we always say on this program, is just it doesn't hit people equally. There's no fairness in how brain damage CTE and the effects of taking punches to the head are dished out. It doesn't make any sense, because Alan Crowder has something like 20 fights. He's been knocked out about 4 times, or TKO'd, so some of those might not even be proper knockouts. But I remember him being knocked out, but I don't remember him taking like thousands of blows to the head. He's had a fairly short career, so he won't have done too many camps compared to someone like Diego Sanchez, Carlos Condit, people like that. And he's saying that he's suffering from memory loss, which is just terrifying. But it just brings us back to that other lad who was I think it was the second MMA fighter to be diagnosed with CTE, because he can only be properly diagnosed, like proven to have it, after death, because it's actual damage to your brain, so they have to autopsy you. Which is why all these pro wrestlers are leaving their brainstem and spinal cord to research foundations after they die. And I think NFL players are doing that too. But he was basically the second guy that they proved had it in MMA, because it's still a very young sport, and there haven't been an awful lot of people died and been autopsied in that time. And he was fighting in Bellator, but I think he'd only had like 4 or 5 fights. It was incredible. Like just the short amount of time and training that it took him to get CTE. Terrifying. But anyway, let's move on. What's going on this weekend? Fuck all is the simple answer. But if you desperately want to watch some fights, there's a Cage Warriors, there's a one thing starting right now as I'm recording this. There's a Cage Warriors, also on tonight, I believe. And then there's Bellator London, which, really doesn't have an awful lot of interesting stuff on, but it does have Fabian Edwards, who's good, against Mike Shipman, who only has 2 losses in 15 fights, so fair enough. Fabian Edwards, obviously I think he's the younger brother of Leon Edwards. And of course, being someone's brother doesn't mean you have anywhere near the same level of talent, but he's certainly, what I've seen of him so far has been decent. Charlie Ward's fighting on the prelims against Pietro Panini. What a great Italian stereotype name. That's a guy from Punch-Out, Pietro Panini. Pietro, rather. And Alfie Davis is also on the undercard, who's an interesting striker. I think is he out Shoot Fighters? Yeah, he's out Shoot Fighters with MVP. And then the main event is Michael Page versus some guy they found at the last minute, Gianni Melillo, rather. Now, this is kind of unfortunate, because this is Derrick Anderson dropping out again. Derrick Anderson has now been booked to fight him twice. But Derrick Anderson is also a lightweight this is his first fight at proper welterweight in forever. He's had a couple of catchweight 160 contests, but it's kind of like Dave Rickles. People go, oh, well, he was an accomplished welterweight. And you go, yeah, but the last time he fought a welterweight was in something like 2012. And he's been a lightweight ever since. It's just like, they won't even sign MVP to fight someone without a big asterisk next to their name. I mean, obviously, Richard Keeley was just an absolute joke of a fight. Because, a guy with, 3-1 he was at the time? Or 2-1, something like that. Guy with less than 5 fights should not be fighting the guy who just fought your world champion. But that's just Scott Coker in a nutshell. But Derrick Anderson has pulled out, so that I think it was about 2 weeks' notice they had. And rather than call up like Curtis Millender, who's just dropped out, been cut from the UFC, or anyone in the welterweight. Well, let's have a look where Giovanni Melillo is ranked. He is the number 4 welterweight in Western Europe, not including people who are fighting in world-class promotions. So yeah, fair enough, but. Yeah, it's just like I don't know. I have no idea what's going on. I think, on the one hand, I think people have picked up by now, and I think the loss to Douglas Lima really hurried this along. People have worked out that knocking out bums, or people well below your level, isn't really impressive. I wrote an article about this years ago. It was the Cyborg loss. It was how Bellator, whatever number that fight was on, taught me that I don't actually care about knockouts. And I basically just said, turns out I'm impressed by people knocking out world-class fighters knocking out world-class fighters. That's impressive. World-class fighter knocking out someone a dozen rungs below who's been brought in, even when the guy he keeps winning, so he's supposed to move forward, but you just keep bringing in low-quality competition so that you can pad out his highlight reel. That's not interesting. That's just manipulative bullshit. But finally, people are tuning into this, finally getting the message that MVP is a good fighter and shouldn't be fighting these people. And that basically all his knockouts are setups. Not in the same way that I didn't even mention it. The Ghazali versus, what was his name? Pronin. That was the fight that everyone was saying was fixed. Some people were saying was fixed, on the Bellator Israel card. And I went and watched it. It took some finding, because I had the prelims and the main card, and I watched both and I couldn't find it, even though he got top billing in Israel. But he's 46 years old. He's a 4th degree BJJ black belt under Renzo, and it was some of the worst grappling you'll ever see in an MMA fight. Pronin had like a 16-4 record or something like that. He was marketed as a young prospect, but a couple of people pointed it out to me. He's never fought anyone with like more than 2 fights and never with a winning record. So literally just padded up to lose to this guy, Ghazali. And it was some of the worst fighting I've ever seen. The guy is basically pulling his punches and throwing wheel kicks that slow down before they get to the target. So it looks fake as hell. When they're on the ground, he's throwing these punches and not really touching him. And then he gets caught in a heel hook at the end. And I say caught very generously. They're talking on commentary about how Ghazali has been training with John Danaher, so he'll be working on his leg locks. And like the first thing that any of the Danaher guys stress is the knee line, where the knee line is. If you lose the knee line, you've lost the heel hook. And that was the whole thing. If you caught, actually Gordon Ryan's new instruction was really good, but he was talking about his match with Lachlan Giles, and he's talking about how he kept his knee free so that no matter what Lachlan Giles was doing, he couldn't actually apply the pressure to seriously damage his knee. And then you watch this fight, and his knee is completely out the other side. He could just turn with this heel hook, but he taps out anyway. It's the dodgiest fight I've ever seen. I'm not going to say it's fixed, but I think this is what I said when I wrote that article, Anatomy of a Fixed Fight. I didn't accuse Bellator of any fight fixing. I would assume that they don't have any interest in fixing fights anyway. If it was a fix, it would be Pronin taking a dive, because that's what it looked like, him sitting there in this guy's guard waiting for him to grab either a triangle or his legs or something. But the thing that I always stress is that it doesn't matter if it's fixed or not. The point is that Bellator keeps putting on fights that are so bad between fighters who are so bad that people think that they're fixed or a work or something like that. And that really tells you about the type of fight that they're booking. But if you haven't seen it, go watch it. Ghazali versus Pronin. It was fucking awful, but in a hilarious way. And then people are asking me, like, what would be the point of fixing that? If the odds aren't a massive long shot. The whole point of a fix is it's very rarely a work like Hume versus Shamrock, where they've clearly planned to do this Northern Lights suplex. There's a degree of working out what's going on from both parties there. But like a dive is much easier because you have one guy go in trying to lose, or just half-heartedly trying to win and then giving the other guy the chance to win, Much easier with submissions, by the way. It's like, I think Takada probably thinks that he legitimately beat Mark Coleman, even though Mark Coleman was past his guard and just moved back into the guard and stood there waiting for him to take a leg. The point of fixing it is to make a bet a certain investment, You don't need to be winning a bet at 7-1. You could win the bet at, I think Ghazali was like 2-3 or something like that. It was American decimal point stuff, so I didn't understand what was going on. But if you put the money down on him and then you asked the guy to take a dive and assured that he would, you're getting the money anyway. You could just put a huge amount down on him. You don't need a 7-1 return, because that's the shit that always trips the authorities. They go, oh, suspicious movement of betting line and whatnot, on massive underdog. You pick a fight people don't care about and you make certain of the result. Like I said, probably not Bellator's fault in any way, but did look really suspicious. Anyway, so MVP is going to try and knock out a bum. If you share the GIF or the highlight or the video or whatever, you're making MMA worse and you're making people at large stupider about fighting. So don't do that. What else is going on this weekend? Glory's got an event on which is a bit weird. You've got Anissa Mexen versus Tiffany Van Soest. This is weird because Mexen's already beaten her twice. I mean, the last one was a split decision, obviously fairly close, but I saw the first one. I watched that live, actually, the first one, and Mexen really just took all her tools away. It was very impressive. But Tiffany Van Soest is a star for Glory, so they're bringing her back. She's won one of her last 3. Both the losses are to Anissa Mexen. Really not done anything since like 2017, but they're bringing her back anyway to take that title fight. I mean, she's a good fighter. She does some really interesting stuff. She'll she comes from a high stance bouncing around. She'll do a step in and then immediately step back. And sometimes people will go for like the inside low kick and then she'll come back in after they've missed it. Does some really interesting stuff, but odd fight. But then, only lost the split decision last time, so maybe this time she gets it. Certainly there's worse stuff you could watch this weekend. And then you got Petch versus Strand. I also saw Strand in New York. That was a really weird fight where he... can't remember how it started out, but it looked like he was going to get outclassed, and then he just hit the guy with like an intercepting jump back kick to the gut and knocked him out. Fucking amazing. Dude's a weird ass, I think he's Kempo or something like that. He's got a weird ass style, and he seemed to have a really big following there. So, well worth a check out. And Petch obviously is legit. And I think you got the Combat Jiu-Jitsu Worlds going on this weekend, but nobody really gives a shit about Combat Jiu-Jitsu. Oh, and the other thing we've got going on this weekend, which I just wrote an article for Unibet for, which you should check out, is Luis Ortiz versus Deontay Wilder 2. Interesting because Luis Ortiz gave Wilder a really hard time in the first one. He's kind of one of those legendary ducked fighters, Luis Ortiz. He's a Cuban heavyweight. And this is why I've been watching tons of Teofimo Stevenson and Felix Cerrone this week. Because basically, obviously, professional sports were banned in Cuba from whenever Castro came in. But when was that? It's 1960. Whenever Batista was ousted, rather. But they've been banned for a while. I think in the 40s and 50s. Well, they'd had world champions before that. They'd had, like, Kid Gavilan, very accomplished fighters, inventor of the bolo punch. And they had this great history of boxing. But once the professional fight ban came in, they just pumped funding into the amateur sports because obviously the Olympics became a big proving ground. And then that was a really interesting time for boxing when the US and the West were trying to beat the Eastern Bloc and the Cubans and people like that. Just really interesting developments in boxing styles. And while I don't like generalizing with national styles, because the teams were so rigidly separate, they really did have very visibly different styles and tendencies. But in the heavyweight division, Cuba had two supermen basically who won 3 gold medals in a row at the Olympics and a ton of world championships in between. I think Felix Cerrone had like 6 world championships and 3 Olympic gold medals. But Teofimo Stevenson was in the 70s and he was like the hero of every Cuban child. And I mean, the thing is, like, whenever you talk about this, there'll be people who are like, yeah, he would have won the world heavyweight title for real if he'd gone professional. And then there are people who are like, it's a completely different game. Look at someone like Pete Rademacher, who came out of winning the Olympic gold, took a world title fight against Floyd Patterson in his first fight and immediately got starched. But then you can look at people like Lomachenko, won a world title in his second professional fight. So there isn't a hard and fast rule on this. But it obviously is a very different game, the professionals game to the amateur game, both in terms of time limits, scoring. They didn't have headgear for a lot of the time that Teofimo Stevenson, but they had it when Cerrone was around. But at any rate, Teofimo Stevenson was offered the fight with Muhammad Ali at one point, and there's a great book called In the Red Corner, which is about a sports journalist who was sent to Cuba on a scouting mission in the 90s. I can't remember if it was on behalf of Don King or Frank Warren or someone like that, but he was basically sent there by... Because there's always this cozy relationship between sports writers and promoters, which just doesn't, shouldn't really happen, but does. It's like Nat Fleischer was scouting talent in Europe for Jack Dempsey's manager when he discovered Max Schmeling. And then years later, obviously, he brought him in to fight Joe Louis and so on. But this guy gets sent to Cuba to try and convince Cerrone to defect and fight Mike Tyson for millions of dollars. Obviously there's always that balance, well, why wouldn't you take the money? It's obviously because you're scared of it or something. But equally, think of where you live and where your family lives and if you were famous there too, it's a big deal if you defect to the US. So Luis Ortiz is interesting because he basically had a very middling sort of, he won medals as an amateur in the early 2000s, but never an Olympic medal, never a gold medal in it. I think he got a world championship or a Pan American championship in 2005, but then his results just slowly dropped off. It was suddenly bronzes and then he just didn't win anything. So in 2010 he defected to the US and he was basically he was 30 years old starting a professional career, and he's fought 3 times a year since then and just fought his way up, got famous for this spectacular punch. Then he fought Deontay Wilder, and he was supposed to be the biggest puncher Deontay Wilder had faced. And he just comes out and goes, oh, yeah, by the way, I can box really well because I was a Cuban amateur. So that's what he does for the first several rounds. He just boxes Deontay Wilder up. And then he gets dropped by Deontay Wilder in the 5th, comes back and drops Deontay Wilder in the 7th or something like that. It's just incredible. Basically, he tried to box him, and then when Deontay Wilder timed him and hit him, which is the big Deontay Wilder plan, you just sit back and wait, which is such a bizarre plan. Like I said, there's no one like Deontay Wilder in boxing, and I don't know if there ever has been anyone like him in boxing. Ortiz had success by, like, when Deontay Wilder hit him with big blows, he just came back and hit him as hard as he could, and Deontay Wilder would go, oh, fuck, and stop trying to knock him out. But finally, Deontay Wilder got the knockout in the 10th, so they got the rematch coming up, and it could be a good one, because the only person that Deontay Wilder has rematched as a professional is, what's his name, Cerrone, who basically he rematched because he didn't knock Cerrone out. It wasn't because Cerrone was good or gave him a hard time. It was to just correct that lack of knockout on the record. So that's going on this weekend, and that'll be fun. So go read that Unibet article. The other thing I published this week for the Patreon boys is the massive rewrite of the guide to cutting off the ring. Big old read, and if you don't like reading very much, it's got tons of diagrams drawn by yours truly, and I put in the audio track, so you can just turn that on, scroll through. But that's for the Patreon boys. So if you want to join the Patreon, support the podcast, and get access to the cool shit that we do, do that. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightscornbypodcast@gmail.com. We will probably need them next week because we are low on stuff going on. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Ben Askren's amazing hair with an Alice band on. Bless.